The sound of gravel crunching under heavy boots echoed across my front yard as 3 sheriff's deputies approached my porch, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. Behind them, Karen Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, wearing that familiar, smug expression that had haunted our neighborhood for the past 6 months. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sun as she pointed dramatically at my mailbox, the same mailbox that had stood in its current location for 37 years. Long before Karen had even heard of our quiet ranch community outside Austin, "There it is. Officers," she announced, her voice carrying that particular blend of authority and victimhood she'd perfected. Clear violation of county postal regulations and HOA property standards. "I've documented everything." She waved a thick manila folder, like it contained state secrets. "That mailbox has been illegally relocated without proper permits or community approval." I leaned against my doorframe, koffiemoog in hand, watching this theater unfold. The lead deputy, a weathered man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, glanced between Karen and my mailbox, then back to me, with barely concealed confusion. The mailbox in Questiona, simple black metal box on a wooden post sat exactly where my grandfather had installed it in 1987, 3 feet inside my property line, perfectly aligned with my gravel driveway. My name is Jack Morrison, and I never expected that moving to my family's ranch property would land me in the middle of a neighborhood war. I'd inherited the 12-acre spread from my grandfather 18 months ago. A modest but beautiful piece of Texas hill country, with a 1960s ranch house, a red barn, and enough space to finally breathe after 20 years of corporate life in Houston. The property came with something I hadn't anticipated: a neighbor who believed the entire county should operate according to her personal vision of suburban perfection. Karen Whitmore had moved into the newly developed Sunset Ridge subdivision that bordered my eastern property line about 2 years earlier. The subdivision was one of those cookie-cutter developments that seemed to sprout overnight identical 2-story houses with manicured lawns, decorative shutters, and HOA-mandated beige everything. My grandfather used to joke that the developers had stolen his view, but he'd been philosophical about it. "Progress," he'd say with a shrug, "happens whether you like it or not." What Grandpa hadn't anticipated was that progress would come with a homeowners association president who viewed his ranch as an eyesore that needed correcting. From the moment I'd moved in, Karen had made it clear that my property was a problem she intended to solve. Never mind that my land was grandfathered in, predating her development by decades. Never mind that I wasn't part of her HOA and had no legal obligation to follow their rules. In Karen's world, proximity meant jurisdiction, and she'd appointed herself the enforcement arm of aesthetic authority. The mailbox situation had started innocently enough. Last month, during routine maintenance on my driveway, I'd noticed the old wooden post was rotting at the base. Any strong wind might have knocked it over, potentially damaging the mailbox and disrupting mail service. So, I did what any reasonable property owner would do. I installed a new post exactly where the old one had been, maybe shifting it 6 inches closer to the house to avoid a soft spot in the ground. That 6-inch adjustment, combined with natural settling, had resulted in a mailbox position that was roughly 3 feet from where it had been the week before. Still on my property. Still legal. Still functional. I'd thought nothing of it until Karen appeared at my door 3 days later with a clipboard and a measuring tape. "Mr. Morrison," she'd said, her tone suggesting I'd committed a federal crime. "I've been monitoring the postal situation on Riverside Road, and your mailbox relocation is in direct violation of several county ordinances and postal service regulations." She'd produced a laminated copy of what she claimed were official guidelines, pointing to highlighted sections about mailbox placement and clustering requirements. I'd explained about the rotting post, shown her the old wood I'd discarded, even offered to show her the maintenance receipts. But Karen wasn't interested in explanations. She was interested in compliance. According to her interpretation of the rules, mailboxes in our area were supposed to be clustered at specific intervals to maintain visual cohesion and postal efficiency. My mailbox, she claimed, was now out of sequence and needed to be moved to the approved location which happened to be directly in front of her property. "I'm not moving my mailbox to your yard." "Karen," I'd said as diplomatically as possible. "It's been in this general location for decades. The Postal Service hasn't complained. That's because they're waiting for community leadership to address the situation." She'd replied, "As HO president, I have a responsibility to maintain standards that benefit everyone. I'm not in your HOA. Your property borders our community. Visual pollution affects property values for everyone in the area." That conversation had ended with Karen promising to pursue appropriate channels to resolve the situation. I'd assumed that meant she'd eventually realize she had no authority over my property and drop the matter. I was wrong. Over the following weeks, Karen's campaign escalated in ways I hadn't thought possible. First came the certified letters official-looking documents on HOA letterhead, demanding compliance with mailbox placement guidelines and threatening legal action. I'd thrown them away, after confirming with a real estate attorney friend that they had no legal standing. Next came the county complaints. Karen had apparently contacted every local agency she could find, filing formal complaints about my mailbox placement, claiming it violated postal regulations, county zoning laws, and even traffic safety requirements. Each complaint triggered an investigation, which meant county officials showing up at my door to examine my perfectly legal mailbox before determining that no violation existed. But Karen's masterpiece came when she discovered that my property technically extended 15 feet further east than I'd realized. The original survey markers were overgrown with brush, and I'd always assumed the fence line represented my boundary. Karen had paid for a professional survey and discovered that a portion of her precious sidewalk actually crossed my property. Instead of acknowledging this boundary issue and suggesting a reasonable solution, she'd filed a police report claiming I was illegally encroaching on HOA common areas. The irony was delicious. While accusing me of mailbox violations, she'd inadvertently proven that her own community had built their infrastructure on my land without permission. But Karen wasn't the type to let facts interfere with her narrative. When the sheriff's deputy explained that the sidewalk encroachment was actually the subdivision's problem, not mine, she doubled down by claiming I'd moved my mailbox specifically to create boundary confusion and harass her residents. That's what had brought us to this moment. 3 law enforcement officers standing in my yard, examining a mailbox that had been in roughly the same location since Ronald Reagan was president. While Karen insisted it represented some kind of criminal conspiracy, the lead deputy, whose nameplate read Martinez, was clearly reaching the end of his patience. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "I've looked at this situation from every angle. The mailbox is on Mr. Morrison's property. It's been there for decades, according to postal records, and there's no county violation. What exactly do you want us to do?" Karen's face flushed red. "Enforce the law. He deliberately moved that mailbox to create visual discord and disrupt postal service efficiency. I have witnesses who saw him relocating it." "Witnesses to what?" I interrupted. "Replacing a rotting post with a new one in the same location? You moved it 3 feet, she snapped. "On my own property. To replace rotting wood? With the same mailbox that's been serving this address for 37 years. Deputy Martinez looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in Texas. "Mr. Morrison, did you file any permits for mailbox relocation? You don't need permits to maintain your own mailbox on your own property." I replied, "I replaced a post. That's it." "He's creating neighborhood chaos," Karen interjected. "The Postal Service expects consistency in mailbox placement. This disrupts the entire delivery sequence for Riverside Road." That's when Deputy Martinez made the mistake of asking Karen to show him the specific regulations she was citing. She opened her manila folder and began pulling out printouts, highlighted documents, and what appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams showing optimal mailbox clustering patterns. As she spread these papers across my truck's hood, it became clear that most of her official regulations were actually HOA guidelines she'd printed from websites, mixed with genuine Postal Service recommendations that didn't apply to rural properties like mine. "Ma'am," Martinez said after examining her documentation, "these are mostly HOA internal policies. They don't have the force of county law, and they don't apply to non-HOA properties. But the visual impact isn't a police matter? Karen's expression shifted from righteous authority to barely controlled fury. Fine. If local law enforcement won't address this situation, I'll be contacting the postal inspector's office, the county commissioner, and the state attorney general. This is clearly harassment designed to undermine our community's property values. As the deputies prepared to leave, Martinez handed me his card. Sir, you might want to consider having your property formally surveyed if there are ongoing boundary disputes. Sometimes having official documentation helps clear up these situations. After they left, Karen stood in my driveway for a full minute, clutching her folder of useless documents. Finally, she looked directly at me and said, "This isn't over. Mr. Morrison, I've spent 2 years building this community, and I won't let one selfish person destroy what we've accomplished." "Karen," I replied calmly, "I moved here to retire peacefully on my family's land. I've never interfered with your community, never complained about your development, never caused problems for anyone. All I did was replace a rotting mailbox post on my own property. Your property is an eyesore that affects everyone." She shot back. "Your rusty barn, your unpaved driveway, your complete disregard for neighborhood aesthetics, that mailbox is just the latest example of your selfishness." That evening, I called my cousin Amy, who practiced property law in San Antonio. I'd been avoiding involving attorneys because the whole situation seemed too petty for legal action. But Karen's threat to contact state authorities suggested she wasn't planning to let this go. "Jack," Amy said after I'd explained the situation, "this woman sounds unhinged, but you might want to take her seriously. HOA presidents sometimes have political connections, and even frivolous complaints can cause headaches if they reach the right desks. What do you suggest?" "2 things. First, get that professional survey Martinez mentioned. If there are boundary issues, you want official documentation. Second, start keeping detailed records of every interaction with this woman. If she's harassing you, you'll need evidence." "Is she harassing me, or am I being oversensitive?" Amy laughed. "Jack, she called the police about a mailbox on your own property that you've had for 40 years. Yeah, I'd call that harassment. I spent that weekend researching property law and reviewing my grandfather's old documents. What I discovered was fascinating. Not only did my property predate the Sunset Ridge development, but the original ranch had included mineral rights, water rights, and something called an agricultural exemption that provided significant legal protections. My grandfather had been paying minimal property taxes for decades because the land was classified as agricultural, which meant it was protected from most zoning restrictions and aesthetic regulations. More interesting was the discovery that the developer of Sunset Ridge had apparently been required to maintain a 30-foot buffer zone between their subdivision and any existing agricultural properties. Looking at my grandfather's plat map and comparing it to the current satellite photos, it appeared that several houses in Karen's development might be encroaching on that buffer zone. But the real bombshell came when I found my grandfather's correspondence with the county from 2019. Apparently, the developers had initially tried to purchase his property as part of their project. When he'd refused to sell, they'd requested a zoning variance to build closer to his property line. My grandfather had opposed the variance, and the county had denied it, mandating the 30-foot buffer I'd just discovered. Karen's pristine community, built to rigid HOA standards and maintained with obsessive attention to detail, was potentially in violation of county zoning requirements, the same county zoning requirements she'd been citing to justify her harassment of my mailbox. Monday morning, I contacted the surveying company Amy had recommended. Within a week, I had official documentation showing not only my exact property boundaries, but also confirmation that the Sunset Ridge development had encroached on both my land and the required buffer zone. Their sidewalk, 2 house foundations, and a decorative gate were all illegally positioned on either my property or the protected buffer area. Armed with this information, I scheduled a meeting with the county planning department. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, which gave me time to organize my documentation and prepare a formal complaint. But before I could file anything, Karen escalated the situation in a way I hadn't anticipated. Thursday afternoon, I came home from running errands to find a tow truck in my driveway and two men in coveralls examining my mailbox. Karen stood nearby with another woman I didn't recognize, both of them holding cameras and measuring tapes. "Excuse me," I called out as I parked my truck. "What's going on here?" The tow truck driver, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the situation, nodded toward Karen. "Ma'am here says this mailbox is illegally positioned and needs to be relocated for Postal Service compliance. She has no authority to relocate anything on my property," I said firmly. "This is private land." Karen stepped forward, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Morrison, I've been in contact with the Postal Inspector's office, and they've confirmed that your mailbox placement violates federal postal regulations. These gentlemen are here to relocate it to the approved position. Show me the federal order." Karen produced a single sheet of paper that appeared to be a printed email. I read it quickly and started laughing. It was a generic response from the Postal Service, explaining general guidelines for mailbox placement in new developments. There was no specific order, no federal mandate, and no legal requirement for me to move anything. This is a form letter. Karen, it has nothing to do with my property. It clearly states that mailboxes must be properly clustered and positioned according to Postal Service standards. For new installations, in developments, my mailbox has been grandfathered for 40 years. The tow truck driver was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some kind of official documentation before I move anything. This lady hired us to relocate a mailbox, but if there's a dispute about authorization..." "There's no dispute," I said firmly. "She has no legal authority to move anything on my property. This is trespassing." That's when Karen made her fatal mistake. Instead of backing down or producing legitimate documentation, she decided to double down on her fabrication. Officer Martinez confirmed that this mailbox was illegally relocated. She announced loudly enough for the growing crowd of neighbors to hear. "The sheriff's department is fully aware of the violation." I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's department directly. "Deputy Martinez, please. This is Jack Morrison on Riverside Road. We have a situation." While I was on the phone, Karen continued directing the tow truck operators and her photographer friend, apparently believing that creating a spectacle would somehow legitimize her authority. What she didn't realize was that several neighbors were recording the entire confrontation, and her claims about sheriff's department authorization were about to be publicly contradicted. Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, clearly irritated at being called out for a second time over the same mailbox. But his irritation quickly shifted to professional concern when he realized what was happening. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "did you tell these people that our department authorized this mailbox removal?" I explained that you confirmed the violation. "I confirmed no such thing. I specifically told you that there was no county violation and that this was not a police matter." Karen's photographer friend had stopped taking pictures. The tow truck driver was already disconnecting his equipment. The small crowd of neighbors was murmuring among themselves, and I could see several phones still recording. "Miss Whitmore," Martinez continued, "making false claims about police authorization is a serious matter. These gentlemen were hired under false pretenses. Mr. Morrison's property rights have been violated, and you've created a public disturbance based on fabricated authority. I was protecting community standards. You were impersonating legal authority and trespassing on private property." That's when I decided it was time to reveal what I'd discovered about the boundary issues. "Deputy Martinez," I said, "while we're discussing property violations, I think you should see this." I handed him the survey results and county correspondence I'd been planning to file the next day. Martinez examined the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, he looked up at Karen and said, "Ma'am, according to this survey, your community is in violation of county zoning requirements and has encroached on Mr. Morrison's property. You might want to contact your HOA's attorney." Karen's face went white as she realized what the documents meant. "That's impossible. Our development was professionally planned and legally approved. Then you'll need to work that out with the county planning department," Martinez replied. "But right now, I need to address the immediate situation. He turned to the tow truck driver. Sir, you're free to go. There's no legitimate work order here. As the tow truck pulled away, Martinez issued Karen a formal trespass warning and advised her that any future contact with me or my property should go through official channels. He also suggested that she might want to consult with her HOA's legal counsel about the boundary violations before pursuing any further action. The crowd of neighbors dispersed slowly, many of them approaching me to apologize for the disruption and express their own frustrations with Karen's behavior. It turned out that several residents had been dealing with her increasingly authoritarian approach to HOA management, and the mailbox incident had finally pushed community opinion past the tipping point. That evening, I received a call from the Sunset Ridge HOA treasurer, a reasonable man named David Chen, who'd been watching the situation with growing concern. Mr. Morrison, he said, I want to apologize for today's incident. Karen was acting without board authorization, and we're taking steps to address the situation. I appreciate that, I replied, but we still need to deal with the boundary issues. Absolutely. I've been reviewing our development plans, and it appears there may have been surveying errors during construction. We'd like to work with you to resolve this amicably. I'm open to reasonable solutions, but I won't be intimidated or harassed. Understood? Karen will not be contacting you again. You have my word on that. Friday morning, I kept my appointment with the county planning department and filed formal complaints about the zoning violations and buffer zone encroachments. The planning director, a woman named Sarah Rodriguez, was familiar with the Sunset Ridge development and not surprised by my findings. We've had several complaints about this particular HOA, she explained. The president seems to believe that aggressive enforcement makes problems disappear, but it usually just creates bigger problems. What happens now? We'll conduct a formal investigation. If violations are confirmed, the HOA will need to bring their development into compliance or face penalties. That could mean relocating structures, paying fines, or potentially losing their occupancy permits for affected properties. And the harassment issues? That's more complex. You could pursue a restraining order if the behavior continues, or consider a civil lawsuit for harassment and trespassing. We can provide documentation of the zoning violations if that helps your case. I left the county building feeling like I finally had some control over the situation. Karen had spent months trying to use bureaucracy and false authority to intimidate me into compliance. Now she was about to discover what real bureaucratic authority looked like when it was properly applied. The next few weeks were remarkably peaceful. Karen, apparently advised by her attorney to avoid further contact, stopped her daily patrols past my property. The HOA hired a professional surveying company to reassess their boundaries and began the expensive process of addressing the zoning violations. Several neighbors reached out to thank me for standing up to Karen's increasingly erratic behavior, but the story wasn't over. Karen, facing potential legal liability for the boundary violations and criticism from her own community, decided to make one final attempt at vindication. She filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office, claiming that I was using fraudulent survey data to harass a legitimate homeowners association. That complaint triggered a state investigation that took 3 months to complete. Investigators reviewed all the documentation, interviewed witnesses, and conducted their own property assessments. Their final report was devastating for Karen and vindicated everything I'd claimed. Not only did the state confirm the boundary violations and zoning infractions, but they also found evidence that Karen had knowingly misrepresented facts to law enforcement, filed false complaints with multiple agencies, and potentially violated state laws regarding harassment and trespassing. The Attorney General's office forwarded their findings to the local district attorney for potential criminal charges. The Sunset Ridge HOA, facing substantial fines and legal liability, voted to remove Karen as president and elected David Chen as her replacement. They also offered to purchase the portions of my land their development had encroached upon, paying fair market value plus legal fees and compensation for the harassment I'd endured. Karen, meanwhile, put her house up for sale and moved out of state before the district attorney could decide whether to file charges. Her departure was so abrupt that she left behind most of her furniture and never collected her final HOA reimbursements. The mailbox that started this entire saga still sits exactly where my grandfather placed it 37 years ago, faithfully serving its purpose, without creating any disruption to postal service efficiency or neighborhood aesthetics. Sometimes I stand beside it in the morning, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the hill country, thinking about the absurdity of how a simple maintenance project had nearly destroyed a woman's life simply because she couldn't accept that some things were beyond her control. The new HOA leadership has proven to be reasonable and professional. They've established clear policies about respecting neighboring properties, and they've even invited me to their community barbecues as a gesture of goodwill. My rusty barn and unpaved driveway apparently no longer constitute threats to suburban civilization. I learned something important from this experience. Sometimes the best defense against unreasonable people is simply standing your ground and letting them destroy themselves with their own extremism. Karen could have lived peacefully next to my property for decades without any conflict. Instead, she chose to wage war over a mailbox and discovered that some wars aren't worth fighting. My cousin Amy still laughs when she tells other attorneys about the case. Karen called the cops on a mailbox, she says, and ended up facing a federal investigation. It's become her favorite example of how small-minded authoritarianism eventually collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. These days, my biggest property management challenge is deciding whether to repair or replace my grandfather's old fence. It's a decision I'll make on my own timeline, according to my own priorities, without consulting any homeowners association or seeking permission from neighbors who think they know better than I do about managing my own land. And my mailbox will stay exactly where it belongs, on my property, serving my address, maintaining the same quiet dignity it's had for nearly 4 decades. Some things, it turns out, are worth defending, not because they're important in themselves, but because the principle of defending them matters more than the convenience of giving in to unreasonable demands.